The year is 1955. Pontiac was to get an all-new 8-cylinder upgrade, going from the straight 8 to the V8. Both Pontiac and Packard were the only companies in the USA to hold on to their straight 8s for as long as they did, both going to the V8 in 1955. Fun fact, an often misconception, 1955 wasn't the first year for Pontiac to offer a V8. For those that don't know, Pontiac actually started off as a companionship make under Oakland. All General Motors brands except for General Motors and Chevy got a companionship make around the year 1929. Oakland got Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Viking. Viking was the only one that was worth more than the parent company. Buick, Marquette, Cadillac, LaSalle. When Pontiac and Oakland switched, Oakland and Pontiac were using a V8, unique in design with horizontal valves, which we covered in this video. If you want to check it out after this episode, you totally can. Pontiac would replace the Oakland V8 with a Pontiac straight 8, and then they would replace the straight 8 with a V8. Kind of weird, right? Unlike other General Motors makes, Pontiac did not have a big block or small block. All engines, the 287 up through the 455, were the same size externally. Pontiac began work on their V8 back in 1946. Engineers wanted to do something special right after the war, and they built a few prototypes, one of which was 269 cubic inch displacement, but it used L-head design where the valves and the pistons were in the block. They would test the engine against the 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket with the overhead valve arrangement. But after coming to terms that the overhead valve arrangement was better and it looked like it was to be the future, and the bean counters and the management team over at Pontiac not seeing the need to replace the inline 8, the V8 Pontiac got placed on the back burner on low, but they were still working on different engine designs. And they would begin work on a 287 cubic inch displacement overhead valve unit. In 1952, Robert Critchfield would take the helm as general manager over at Pontiac and was looking towards the future. The straight 8 wasn't going to cut it. Also, he wanted to move Pontiac more upmarket, more in Oldsmobile's position, so they needed a V8. And despite being behind the 8 ball, Pontiac was able to look at Oldsmobile and the Cadillac V8s for inspiration. By 1953, Pontiac would have somewhere in the neighborhood of 23 prototypes, which they would install in 1953 Pontiac models, and they were planning on offering the V8 in 1953 because it was all set and ready to go. But Buick and Chevrolet complained to upper-class General Motors management to put a hold on Pontiac's release of their V8 by 2 years because Buick wanted to be the only General Motors brand to offer a V8 in 1953, and Chevrolet's V8 wasn't yet ready. Pontiac V8 engine architecture started off with the monoblock design where the crankcase and the cylinder blocks were cast as one single unit. Both the block and the head were cast of tried and true cast iron. The right bank of cylinders is slightly more forward than the left bank of cylinders, so the fuel pump is located on the left side. This engine has fully pressurized oil and lubrication system, and there are 4 main galleries inside the engine, 2 of which were inside the engine block and then 1 in each cylinder head to ensure that everything gets oiled. The oil is delivered under pressure to the crankshaft connecting rods, camshaft, etc. Everything inside this engine is lubricated with a stream of oil. Pressurized suction crankcase ventilation. Crankshaft was forged steel in most cases, dynamically balanced by 6 counterweights. For engine smoothness, the crankshaft rides 5 main bearings. Tapered camshaft with the higher side towards the rear. The valve train consisted of ball pivot rocker arms, which were set into the head instead of using a separate rocker shaft. Designed by Clayton Leach in 1948 at the request of Ed Cole, general manager of Chevrolet, which they would lift off of the Pontiac engine and put into the later Chevrolet V8. Which was a practice that General Motors didn't really do. Each division had their own thing, but, Chevrolet had their own rules, and they could just take things from other engines at will. Camshaft actuated hydraulic lifters move push rods, which in turn move rocker arms. Valves open and close on the pivot action. Wedge-shaped combustion chambers. Fun fact, all Pontiac V8s from 1955 through 1959 used the gusher cooling system, which coolant flowed in reverse, but by 1960 that feature would be gone in favor of a lower roof profile. So I know we're like 5 minutes into this video by now, but before getting into all of the engine displacements, we're going to do a different video. We're going to separate the small journals from the large journals, but we will follow up the large journal episode. It will be the very next episode to be featured on this channel. And we have to draw the line somewhere because otherwise this engine episode is going to be like 45 minutes long. So just to reiterate, engines that will not be in this episode, they will be in a different episode, are the 421, 428, 455, and the SD series. It's going to be covered in the very next episode. Making its debut in 1955, 287.2 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 4.7 liters. It's good for anywhere between 180 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor to 200 horsepower with a 4-barrel carburetor at 4,600 RPM, making up to 278 pound-feet or 377 Newton meters around 2,800 RPM with a bore of 3.75 inches and a stroke of 3.25 inches. Compression was 8-to-1 with 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used, 1955. In 1956, the 287 was bored out to 3.9357 inches, bringing displacement to 316.6, oftentimes just referred to as the 317. Cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 5.2 liters. It was good for anywhere between 192 all the way up to 285 horsepower at 5,100 RPM, up to 330 pound-feet or 447 Newton meters at 3,600 RPM with a bore of 3.9375 inches and a stroke of 3.25 inches. Compression is anywhere between 7.9 to 10-to-1. Years this engine was used, 1956. In 1957, the 317 was stroked to 3.625 inches, bringing overall displacement to 347 cubic inch displacement. Overhead valve V8 5.7 liters. It was good for anywhere between 227 all the way up to 317 horsepower with a special cam at 5,000 RPM, up to 359 pound-feet or 487 Newton meters at 2,900 RPM, with a bore of 3.9375 inches and a stroke of 3.5625 inches. Compression is 8.5 to 1025-to-1. This engine was used in 1957. 1957 was the first year Pontiac offered tri-power or 3 2-barrel carburetors from the factory. It's also important to note that 630 Bonnevilles were produced with fuel injection. In 1958, bore would increase to 4.0625 inches, bringing displacement to 369.4, oftentimes just referred to as simply the 370 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 6.1 liters. Nicknamed the Tempest V8, it produced 310 horsepower at 4,800 RPM, 400 pound-feet or 542 Newton meters around 3,000 RPM with a bore of 4.0625 inches and a stroke of 3.5625 inches. Compression was 10.5-to-1. Years used, 1958, 400 of which were equipped with fuel injection. In 1959, a legend, a Pontiac staple, was born. The stroke was increased to 3.75 inches, bringing overall displacement to that legendary 389. Cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 6.4 liters. It's important to note that the 389 was the first Pontiac engine to be offered in Super Duty. The SD will be covered in part 2, not this episode. It produced anywhere between 215 to 368 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, up to 431 pound-feet or 584 Newton meters at 3,200 RPM with a bore of 4.0625 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. Compression was anywhere between 8.6 to 1075-to-1. Years this engine was used, 1959 through 1966, and this would be Pontiac's base engine for their full-size cars. Some notes worth mentioning: main bearing size would grow to 3 inches. This engine uses a nylon timing gear coating, which would come off over time and the pieces would get clogged in passages inside the engine. Some sources state that the problem could appear around 30,000 to 40,000 miles. In the early 60s, Buick and Oldsmobile would produce a small aluminum V8. Buick would share a V8 with Pontiac, which would power the Tempest. General Motors would drop that engine in 1963, so Pontiac needed a smaller engine to fill that void. So Pontiac would take their 389 and would keep the 375-inch stroke, but they would change the bore to 3.78 inches, bringing overall displacement to 336.6 cubic inch displacement. Overhead valve V8 5.5 liters. Now, it's important to note that this engine has a lot of mystery and a lot of lore around it. It was a 336 cubic inch displacement engine, but it was oftentimes just referred to as the 326. And this engine, not to get confused with the earlier 1958 through 1959 General Motors 336 that was derived from the earlier 370 Pontiac. This engine could produce 350 to 260 horsepower with 2 different compression ratios. It only came with a 2-barrel carburetor, and it made that horsepower around 4,800 RPM, 352 pound-feet, or 477 newton-meters, around 3,200 RPM, with a bore of 3.78 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. The 2 compression ratios were either 8.6 or 1025 to 1. This engine was only used for 1 year. Bore would be reduced again to 3.72 inches, bringing displacement to an actual 326 cubic inch displacement. Overhead valve V8 5.3 liters. It could make up to 285 horsepower with the high output version, around 5,000 RPM. Up to 359 pound-feet, around 3,200 RPM, with a bore of 3.72 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. Years this engine was used: 1963 through 1967. In 1967, Pontiac would retire the 389. They would take the 389 block and bore it out to 4.21 inches, bringing overall displacement to 400 cubic inch displacement. Overhead valve V8 6.6 liters. It was good for anywhere between 180 to 370 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, up to 445 pound-feet, around 3,400 RPM, with a bore of 4.12 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. Compression was anywhere between 7.6 to 10.5 to 1. Years this engine was used: 1967 through 1978. They stopped building the engine, but there was cars in 1979 that got the 400. They just stopped building it in 1978. In 1968, the 326 would retire and it would be replaced with a 353.8, oftentimes just referred to as Pontiac's 350 cubic inch displacement V8 5.7, 5.8 liters. It was good for anywhere between 200 to 330 horsepower on the high output model. It made that power at 4,400 RPM with a bore of 3.875 inches and a stroke of 3.75 inches. The years this engine was used: 1968 through 1981. In 1969, Pontiac would unveil the Trans Am Firebird, and they would put an absolute epic engine in for 1969, but this engine was not available for the public. This was built to compete in the SCCA Trans Am Road Racing. It featured a short deck. It was race only, and there's only said to have been 25 made. 303 cubic inch displacement, overhead valve V8 5 liters. It was good for an impressive 475 horsepower at 5,000 RPM with a bore of 4.125 inches and a stroke of 2.84 inches. It was only available in 1969 and it wasn't available for the public. In 1977, Pontiac would build a smaller displacement engine to be the new base engine for Pontiac. General Motors would also use this engine and other General Motors products from 1977 through 1981. This engine would use a shorter deck taken from the 303 race engine. This engine displacement would be 301 cubic inch displacement. It was a thin wall casting V8 to reduce weight. The crankshaft only used 2 counterweights. It also featured lighter connecting rod journals. This engine weighed less than a small block Chevy. The heads were of a different design as well, featuring Siamese intake ports. Because the heads and the intake ports were different, a new intake manifold was needed. 301 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 4.9 liters. It was good for anywhere between 135 to 170 horsepower. You could get 210 horsepower out of it when turbocharged.
It's also important to note that by 1972, we went from gross horsepower, which was the absolute best world number without power robbing accessories like water pumps, power steering pumps, or crank-driven accessories, to more like net horsepower. Think of it as gross pay and net pay. These are net figures.
Up to 345 pound-feet or 468 newton meters at 2,800 RPM with a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 3 inches. Years this engine was used, 1977 through 1981. The final V8 of this family would come in 1980, and it was only produced until 1981. 265 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 4.3 liters. It was good for 120 horsepower at 4,400 RPM with a bore of 3.75 inches and a stroke of 3 inches, 5 main bearings. After 1981, the Pontiac V8 was discontinued and it was replaced by the General Motors corporate V8 from Chevrolet and Oldsmobile to streamline and to try to reduce cost. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather, and these are not fair by any stretch of the imagination. So which one was your favorite V8 choice out of all of them? In the comment section below. Aside from your favorite Pontiac V8 engine, which one of these would you rather have? 1957 Pontiac Chieftain, or 1961 Pontiac Ventura, or 1958 Pontiac Bonneville? I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. On to the second scenario, 1970 Pontiac Firebird, or 1965 Pontiac Grand Prix, or 1969 Pontiac GTO Judge. Once again, going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to give the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. If you've made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching all of this. I just want to say that if I got anything wrong, please put what I got wrong in the comment section. I do a lot of research, but the research is only as good as the information that is out there. And I don't know what's been up with Google. It hasn't been a very good search engine the last few years. When you type in certain things, it doesn't give you what you're looking for, or it just tells you that it is. Like a couple episodes back, we did a 1964 Mercury. And when you type 1964 Mercury in the box, it shows you different options besides a 1964 Mercury. I've had people in the past say, "Oh, you got that wrong. That's wrong information. You're giving out misinformation. You should be ashamed of yourself for misinformation." But then whenever I respond to them and say, "What exactly did I get wrong?" they never respond. So just being transparent with you guys, I'm only one person. I don't have an editor or anything to help me out with these videos. So if you find any misinformation or information that's just not 100% right, please make comments in the comment section about what is right and what is wrong. Thank you guys all so much for everything. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for making this an awesome car community. And until next time, toodaloo!